I'm Rick Nelson, and on behalf of AASHTO's Committee on Maintenance, their Maintenance Operations Technical Working Group, and the Winter Weather Management Technical Service Program, formerly known as SICOP, SICOP Talks Winter Ops is proud to host this fourth National Winter Maintenance and Road Weather Briefing. Now, these briefings give organizations working in the severe weather and maintenance operations space an opportunity to showcase their efforts to help you achieve your winter maintenance and operations mission. Now, this briefing features the Northwest Passage Pool Fund study, and with us is Dave.Huft from the South Dakota Department of Transportation. Hey, it's good to see you again, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Rick.
Dave, before we get started with the briefing, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and South Dakota's involvement in the Northwest Passage?
Sure. Um, I'm the ITS program manager here in South Dakota DOT, and prior to taking that position a couple of years ago, I was the research program director for quite a long time. And the Northwest Passage is a pool fund study that's been in existence for quite a long time. South Dakota hasn't always been a member of the pool fund study. The Minnesota Department of Transportation is the lead state in the pool fund study, but some years ago I was elected to chair the steering committee for the Northwest Passage pool fund study, so that's why I'm here to represent what the pool fund study has been accomplishing.
All right. So, well, Dave, with that, you want to go ahead and give us a briefing on what y'all have been doing here lately?
Sure, be happy to do that. So I mentioned that the Northwest Passage Pool Fund study has been around for a long time. In fact, 20 years, because it started in 2003. And the concept of the Northwest Passage is it is the states that lie along I-90 and I-94 all the way from Minnesota out to Washington, or from Washington to Minnesota, depending which way you are oriented. At various times, Wisconsin has been a member of the pool fund study, but not for the last handful of years. Originally, it was a $25,000 a year contribution to be a member of the pool fund study, and just last year we upped it to $30,000 per state per year contribution. And with that money, we develop annual work plans. And in the annual work plan, there might be a half dozen modest research projects that are of common interest to us 7 states. And we collaboratively decide which projects we're going to fund. Typically, we'll have 20 or more suggestions on the menu to choose from. And that becomes our program for the year. And we are oriented mostly towards operations and ITS in various forms. And we're trying to address some of our common challenges. And among these states, we've got pretty vast rural expanses. So when you get in the eastern side of Washington through Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, and then into Minnesota until you reach Minneapolis, it's mostly rural highway. The urban areas are modest. Seattle lies on one end and Minneapolis on the other end, but there's nothing of comparable size in between. Towns like Billings and Bozeman and Bismarck and Rapid City and so forth, Sioux Falls, but certainly smaller urban areas than the big metros. This is a significant commercial and recreational travel corridor. Commercial in terms of truck traffic especially from Chicago up towards through Minnesota, through South Dakota, up to the West Coast at Seattle and Tacoma. And also a lot of national parks. So we have Yellowstone and Glacier and the Black Hills and the Badlands, and a lot of different recreational corridors or destinations that people travel. And so it's kind of got a unique flavor in that respect. Another thing that is our common interest is extreme weather.
Right.
So this past winter was a case in point. We had maybe the worst winter in a decade and a half or more. In South Dakota, we had almost 40 occasions of interstate highway road closures for some period of time. And other states, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, had similar experiences. Minnesota had closures. and it was just a heavy, heavy snowfall, high winds, bitter cold. Some cases involving rescues of people who were stranded, and so this was a serious winter, and really it's an interest of all of our states. And so when I mention road closures here, it's primarily weather that induces road closures, but there were road closures last year to different kinds of weather. There was heavy rains in Montana and some landslides and flooding. And so there were closures for other reasons, not just winter blizzards. The vision statement for the Northwest Passage is to develop effective methods for sharing, coordinating, integrating travel information, operational activities, and emerging technologies across state and provincial borders. Now, we mention Canadian provinces in the vision statement. We haven't had strong involvement. It's been very occasional where a Canadian province has connected into what we're doing. But it is part of our vision, recognizing that half of the Canada-U.S. border borders the states from Minnesota to Washington. And so it is a significant thing. The verbs there, sharing, coordinating, integrating, are significant also. A lot of what we do is information exchange. We do a lot of studies that explore our various practices, our various needs, and it really hasn't been a way for us states to learn from each other. We're trying to move more into coordinating and integrating activities where we would actually have joint deployments of technology. And that's a little harder to coordinate because you have to essentially coordinate independent agencies to do
Right.
something together. Now, some of the initiatives under the uh, the Infrastructure Act encourage that kind of thing, and so we are consciously looking in that direction to see if there are things we can do. Our focus areas have been the 6 that are shown here: traveler information, especially in terms of 511. For a short period of time, we operated a collaborative travel information site. That wasn't sustainable in the long run, but it was a concept of how several states could share information and present one common interface to travelers. Planning and program management. This would relate to our infrastructure projects, our ITS projects. Freight, one of our task groups is focused particularly on freight, and that has become more important, I'll say, in the past 5 years of the pool fund study. Integrating emerging transportation technologies is important, especially ITS-related things. Staffing and resources. We had a lot of challenges, especially during COVID, but we have ongoing challenges about recruiting and allocation of personnel and other resources. So these are of common interest. And then maintenance and operations of the road system, not just for winter maintenance, but in general, maintenance and operations. So these dominate our discussions and our activities. Our working groups, first of all, include a steering committee, and one representative from each member state is designated as their steering committee representative. We meet monthly online, monitor the status of projects, set priorities. We do meet one time annually in person, typically in the April or May timeframe in the spring. And at that meeting, we assess what we've been doing for the past year in a more comprehensive fashion, and also determine the next year's research program. So with the funding that we've received, we'll allocate that funding to, I'll say 5 or 6 research projects that would benefit all of us. So that's a pretty important meeting. Another real strong benefit of that meeting is just being able to get together and in person discuss our experiences, our needs, what's happened to us. For example, in this spring's meeting, our experience from the past winter was dominant in the discussion because in fact, it was still going on at that time.
Right.
It hadn't ended. The second major working group is called the Operations Task Force, and this is really concerned with the operations side of things, and it could be operations in the traditional sense of maintenance and road operations. It's also operations in the more current sense of transportation systems operations. And so some of the ITS and TSMO topics are ones that the Operations Task Force takes on. Brandon Bisey from North Dakota chairs that particular group. And they put on webinars nearly every month, about 9 times per year, and with a focused topic each time. And we try to engage not just steering committee members, but other people from our DOTs that are involved in these topics. And a lot of the times there will be some round robin exchange where people from Minnesota can explain what they're doing, people from Idaho can explain what they're doing, and get the benefit of each other's knowledge and experience. And then the third group is the Freight Task Force, and it operates similarly to the Operations Task Force, but it's strictly focused on freight. And when I say focused on freight, that's a little bit of a misleading statement because there are so many angles to freight. There's freight planning, there's permitting, there's electronic screening, there's enforcement, roadside enforcement. And so the Freight Task Force has a pretty diverse membership from members of state police, if they're in charge of motor carrier enforcement, to DOTs, to freight planners and DOTs. And the other thing that's kind of a challenge in this area is that every state seems to have a unique approach to how they handle freight organizationally. And so we're learning a lot from each other in that respect of what the possibilities are and what works best in each place. The Operations Task Force, their purposes include establishing and maintaining relationships among operations people. So as I mentioned, it's not just steering committee members, but it's other operational people in each department that participate to share our knowledge and experience. We want to increase interaction during major events. Well, what does that mean? Well, one South Dakota major event is the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally. So we have traffic coming in from Minnesota. Even on I-90, there's noticeable traffic increases on Interstate 90 as far east as Minnesota. Certainly coming in from Montana and Wyoming from the west. Other highways, not just interstate highways. But it's led to coordination there. We also discuss our operations going into winter and coming out of winter. Because winter is such a significant thing in our part of the country. We want to enhance our operations maintenance and TSMO capability. I think we have a variation of experience in the corridor. I'd say that Minnesota and Washington are the most experienced because of their urban areas. Some of our rural areas are not as long in the business of active traffic management. And so, but all of us have opportunities to improve what we're doing and learning from each other. And then on these research projects we also want to support the implementation of findings. We don't want to just do an assessment or a study and then park it away on the shelf. All of the studies are on the Northwest Passage website, which is a valuable resource, but really we want to put those into practice, not just do the research and forget about it. The Operations Task Force puts on webinars through the year. I mentioned that earlier. They can vary from 30 minutes to an hour and a half, and some of the topics are listed here. We had one on AVL advancements in winter operations, approaches for detecting worker presence in work zones. Two of our states, MnDOT and Minnesota and Washington State, have work zone data exchange initiatives, so we're all paying attention to their projects. North Dakota's had some interesting work on autonomous attenuator and mowers. One thing we do every year is something called an annual technicians forum, and it's patterned after something that's done by the I-5 states on the western part of the country, California, Oregon, and Washington. And it's looking at sort of hot topics in related to more hands-on ITS technology. We had a project on winter maintenance performance measures that's building off of an NCHRP project on that topic. an annual recap of winter and flood season by state. We did that in May after the winter was over, and comparing notes, lessons learned from all of our states, and approaches for alerting travelers of snowplows or maintenance vehicles. Um, that was another one. And then I mentioned the 2022 flooding in Montana and a lot of instructive lessons from Montana's response. That all happened overnight, literally,
Right.
but they were very effective in restoring the transportation there. So a lot for us to learn.
Now, so Dave, when you go through these webinars, like this approach for alerting
Hmm.
travelers of snowplows, was that a research project that you all had done that you talked about during the webinar, or how did that
Sometimes
work?
they are, and sometimes they're just something that people are working on, and it's a sharing of what everyone's doing. In this case, some of the states in the Northwest Passage had been doing some things with onboard equipment or providing information to DMSs where snowplows were working, and it was more of an exchange of information rather than a commissioned research.
Okay, because that sounds like some really interesting stuff that folks watching this briefing might be interested in.
Yeah, and these are typically recorded and would be accessible at the website.
Okay.
The Freight Task Force, as I said, is focused on the topic of freight, but that's a pretty broad focus. And also part of our goal is to develop a community of freight-related people in the Northwest Passage states. We're showing 3 states here: Washington, Idaho, and Montana. That's not because only 3 states are involved in the Freight Task Force. It's because one of our studies focused on those 3 states. It had to do with looking at the way way stations bypass trucks and whether there were opportunities to streamline operation. For example, there was a way station in Washington, but soon after crossing the line into Idaho, trucks are inspected again. And one possibility is maybe that information could be shared and save stopping a truck uh, to the benefit of the shipping community. Um, but all of the states are involved in the Freight Task Force. We also have informational web meetings. Some of the topics we've looked at are best practices on project funding opportunities, especially multi-state projects. And so we looked at opportunities that are now available through the Infrastructure Act, and also looking at some recent projects that other states have done that have involved more than one DOT doing something together. A project that's just wrapping up is looking at truck parking availability and information, with the idea of developing a truck parking information management system that would be multi-state in nature. That could be one of our multi-state collaborative projects. Very strong possibility there. We looked at truck platooning concepts and regulations and worked hard to arrange a platooning demonstration, only to have the truckers back out prior to having it happen. We haven't seen much platooning activity in our northern tier of states yet. We were hoping to encourage that, but not yet. Um, we assessed the virtual way station applications among the various states and had recommendations of how we could coordinate that more closely together. Feasibility of improving commercial motor vehicle travel by streamlining e-screening. That was the topic that involved 3 states here: Washington, Idaho, and Montana. We had another project that looked at the states of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, that looked at oversized, overweight permitting processes, and again looking at opportunities and obstacles to doing permitting for big, oversized, overweight loads across state borders. When we focus in on 3 states or 4 states for an assessment, the intent isn't that the findings are only relevant to those states. We're just using that as a case study and applying the findings across the corridor. It's not restricted to just those few states. And as I said, the truck parking information management assessment could well lead to a collaborative project to build a an information system sharing parking availability. One of the obstacles for us at the moment is we do not have a lot of sensing of truck parking spaces.
Mhm.
Minnesota has done a little. Washington has done a very little. And those of us in between haven't really, we're just only beginning to look at it. So there's a lot of opportunity for us here. It is an important topic, and geography dictates that a little bit. So if you're going from Chicago to Seattle, 10 hours puts you in the middle of South Dakota on your operating hours. That's
Right.
kind of the way you have to think about things: is where do hours of service run out for really dominant trip types? And so that's the way we're trying to look at the topic.
Right. And then when you throw weather into that,
Hmm.
delays because of either reduced speeds or closures along the route, that that really throws a wrinkle into that whole truck parking uh, problem.
Correct. Yeah. Some other projects that are nearly done. These are just in the final review of the report. Not all of these reports that are done are also posted on the website, and it's open to anybody who wants to look. So one of them looked at a problem we really experienced this past winter. When we closed interstate highways, we would find people stranded on county roads nearby. And the universal answer is, how did you get here? To the question, how did you get here, was my app sent me here. And we had a project trying to engage with third-party information providers to find out what can we do together to prevent that sort of thing. We had instances where it might be a California car and the people in the car were wearing flip-flops and they're stuck in a snowbank 3.5 feet deep. And, it's a life and death thing. It's not trivial. And so we are working with third-party providers to try to figure out how to improve that situation. Something that the US DOT has going on is the Work Zone Data Exchange, WZDX. And so one of our projects was to assess each of our state's traveler information system to determine whether we satisfied the requirements for WZDX or whether there were deficiencies. And so it's a really nice reference for us to say, well, in the case of South Dakota, we meet this, and this. All we need to do is add this,
Mhm.
and we would qualify for the Work Zone Data Exchange. And that project is just finishing up. And then another project which was kind of important to some of the states in particular was documenting the benefits of travel information provided by DOTs. And I think sometimes we take that for granted. Well, of course, this information is valuable, but sometimes managers or public officials will say, well, why is the state doing this? Aren't there third-party organizations that provide traveler information? Why do we even need to spend money on this? But of course, a lot of the information that's on those third-party sources originates from the DOTs.
Right.
And this study clearly documents the benefits of having this travel information and allays some of those concerns of why in the world are you wasting time on something like this. We just met in the beginning of May to select our projects for the next fiscal year, FY 2024. We operate on MnDOT's fiscal years, which are July to June. And so we'll just be starting this in a few days.
Hmm.
One of the projects is continuation of support for the Operations Task Force, and one of our consultants, Athey Creek, supports that. Another one is continuation of support for the Freight Task Force, and a different consultant firm, CPCS, which is more of a freight-oriented firm, supports that. And then the discrete studies, one is called Providing Recommended Routes to Mapping and Navigation Companies When There's a Closure on the Primary Route. It's a long title, but
Right.
it's kind of the second phase of what I mentioned before, of looking at the problem of sending vehicles where they shouldn't be, to more proactively providing information to third-party travelers of where should they be sent, or should they be sent at all. And there are circumstances when the traffic should just stop. They shouldn't be routed somewhere.
Right. Is it,
Um,
Dave? Are those third parties? Are they like an active player? Are they interested in providing this information, or is this going to be a heavy lift for state agencies to get them engaged?
it's a mix. Some are very interested, and others are harder to establish contact with. It's harder to get a dialogue going,
Uh-huh.
and so it is a mix.
Yeah, I would
But
think
we'll,
from a driver's safety, I mean, just from the safety of the motoring public, that would come up on their list of things that they would be interested in.
well, I would think so. If my navigation provider sent me in a county road in a roaring blizzard and got me stuck, I would not be a happy customer.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
exactly.
just my perception. So it would seem to me it would be in everybody's interest for us to be able to do this successfully. Another thing we're looking at is purchasing data from vendors of connected vehicle data. Um, as things stand now, states are sort of one by one acquiring information from third from INRICs or here or other applications. And one of the things we want to look at is whether there's some way to leverage as a group um, the supplying of that information and maybe provide a more comprehensive and more economical feed for that. There are more and more applications of that data all the time. Another thing that's kind of a national issue in the freight area relates to what's called allowable weights for divisible loads during declared emergencies. And that has kind of a special term, but meaning there is a provision in federal rule that allows trucks to carry greater than ordinarily legal loads on interstate highways during declared emergencies. But it's somewhat limited. The only emergencies that are really qualified for that are natural disaster kind of things, earthquakes, stuff like that. And what's interesting about that is during COVID, this was allowed. It actually was not lawful to be allowed when people started looking at the statute and really examining it. Things like COVID or a cybersecurity emergency or something like that, a man-made emergency, would not qualify under existing law, really.
Oh,
The other thing that was quite interesting is that during COVID, the status of the emergency was unclear. There was no declared emergency, but people perceived an emergency, and some states started allowing overweight loads on interstates before the emergency was actually declared. And ordinarily, it requires a presidential declaration. The president never did declare an emergency. It was sort of declared after the fact through one of the congressional acts, but that needs to be cleared up. There's also a real strong perception among the states that the ability to declare emergencies ought to extend to the governors, because not everything that would warrant this kind of hauling is a national emergency.
it could be a
Maybe it's
local
something
one,
that
right?
has happened. It's more local, and maybe a couple of states, and in the interests of quick response, it would be better for that to be declared more quickly, locally. And then one other thing that you cannot do now, although some have done it, but it is afoul of current rule. If you know a hurricane is coming, you cannot say we'll allow you to haul heavier loads in preparation for the hurricane. Under current rule, it only applies after the fact. And of course, there would be instances where it would be very constructive to allow the hauling
Right.
ahead of time. So these are things that we're trying to promote in national legislation. Another thing that the Midwest states did after COVID was they established a memorandum of understanding among themselves that if we're going to allow overweight loads, how much overweight will we allow? And that's to avoid the problem that one state allows a lot and another state allows a little, and the truck trying to cross state lines still has a problem.
Right.
And so that's what we're going to address in the Northwest Passage states, and try to be the impetus for the Western states to do that same thing. Situational data exchange is a little bit different. It's a project in which any state could input traveler information. It would be translated into a common uniform format and then made available to the world, whether that's automobile manufacturers, trucking companies, third-party information providers, anyone. And so we're looking at the business models for how that would work. We've done technical studies and know that it can be done, but we have to get to the point where not only can it be done, but will it be done? And so
Right.
that's what we're after. And then the last topic that we've picked has to do with truck travel times and needs for truck parking assessment. And this is looking, as I mentioned, for things like where the 10 hours runs out from Chicago, or other special circumstances that would tell you there's a particular need for truck parking along the I-90 and I-94 corridor. So these are the projects that we'll be undertaking after July 1. There are a lot of benefits to participating in the pool fund study. Of course, you establish a network of peers and contacts in all the various DOTs. You get to collaborate with each other, actually establish working relationships. We have a better understanding of regional issues. So by being in the pool fund study, I not only understand South Dakota's issues, but I also understand how that might relate to Wyoming's or Montana's or even Washington State's. So just a deeper and broader understanding of the issues. We gain a lot from our shared ITS and operational experience. It's a forum for sharing lessons learned. We do have a very well-maintained website. I mentioned that the webinars are recorded, the reports are all posted, and everything's easily found. Our consultants do a great job of keeping that up to date. The project reports are all well done and there. Good meetings, virtually and in person, staff involvement, data and information sharing. And maybe the last one, the motivation and valuable project ideas. It's not just hearing about what other people are doing, but also hearing about possibilities and ideas that they have. And it really is, I'd say, inspirational, because you get beyond your own thinking and are stimulated by what others are contemplating.
Right. Whenever you get into a room and you start talking about your common challenges, there's a synergy that takes place.
Yeah.
And out of that are ideas and concepts that are greater than the individuals alone.
Yeah, agree completely. We do have a few challenges. One is we have transitions of staff within member DOTs. So you don't just assume because you know everybody that you know everybody a week from now, because there can be changes. But that's part of it. I mean, the turnover of people is also an enriching thing, because now you gain even more new ideas. But it is sometimes a little bit of a challenge in continuity. Everybody has competing work responsibilities, so this is everybody's extra hobby in a way. We do have consultant support, but it's light support. It's not as though we have a full-time staff that for Northwest Passage working for us. And the last thing I would mention is related to the idea that we would like to engage in multi-state deployments. We really have some work to do there, because of the level of commitment that you have to obtain from each participating DOT. And the people that are on the steering committee of the Northwest Passage are people like me that are, kind of a second level down in some level of management. We're not the CEOs of our DOTs, so we just can't, proclaim our commitment to anything. It's something that we all have to sell to our DOTs. But that is a direction that we really want to go, where we can have tangible on-the-road accomplishments that derive from our effort here. So if you have questions, be happy to discuss this with anybody. I'd say it's a little bit of a closed group in the sense of
Right.
it is corridor based. We're not inviting members from other corners of the country. I will say, though, that we are really trying to collaborate with other corners of the country. So, one of the dialogues we have opened up was with the Eastern Transportation Coalition. And so, we've made it a point, and they have made it a point also with us to uh, begin and continue dialogue on topics of interest, both in the freight and the operations area. And that's one other corridor. There are other ones, of course, along the West Coast, along the southern tier of the country, and up through Utah and so forth. And um, we would sure be happy to um, have dialogue with any of them. And
The challenges that you face and that are faced in other corridors, I mean, while they may be geographically unique, I think operationally they share a lot of commonality.
mhm.
And the work that you're doing, I think, even though it's geographically focused, is transportable. I mean, I think of some of the truck parking things and some of the other projects that you had listed up there. Is like that got my interest. It's like I think I'm going to go check those things out and see if they might not be relevant other places.
No, we'd welcome any conversation with anyone else who's got common interests.
Well, Dave, thanks so much for the update on Northwest Passage. You guys have really got a lot of interesting stuff going on up there.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share it. Appreciate that, Rick.
So, Dave, your contact information and the links to the Northwest Passage, the projects, the webinars, will be listed below this video, and we'll put them in the show notes so folks can reach out directly and learn more about not only the pool fund study but the important work that y'all have been doing.
Many thanks.
Until next time, thanks for listening in and stay safe out there.